Well, good morning, class. I'm here again in Chincoteague. Not so nice a day today. Raining, windy, little chilly, but good to be here anyway. So I wanted to take a moment to wrap up the very great discussion we were having on Hugh of St. Victor and the School of St. Victor. So someone asked a really good question. What is it that really makes Hugh of St. Victor a watershed figure? Why is he a watershed figure when he just seems to repackage Augustine? And that's a really good question. So does he simply repackage Augustine? Well, in some ways, yes, because he is the Alter Augustinus, the second Augustine. But remember, there's a couple of principles about Hugh of St. Victor that make him very different than Augustine at the same time. For one, actually three principles, I think. The first would be he's a little bit more skeptical of allegory. He is very much recognizing that the Origen letter and spirit model of interpretation, where we allegorize texts, and that's where the real cash value of them lies, has dangers, is fraught with difficulties, because there's not really a way to check to see if these interpretations are just the interpreter's imagination getting the better of him, or that there really are drawing out meanings of the Bible itself. Be it may that though it be that the allegories are used by the New Testament writers sometimes, well, I mean, are we okay to use them? And how do we know that our allegories are really, measure up to good standards of interpretation, where we're not simply making things up ourselves, that we really are drawing out a deeper meaning? So that's one thing. So you see that skepticism of the Origen model of interpretation reflected in Hugh. The second thing about Hugh is that Hugh took the trouble to learn Hebrew. Okay, that's also different than Augustine. Remember, Augustine read the Bible only in Latin. He appears not really to have known Greek very well, and he certainly didn't know Hebrew. That no one has ever alleged that. So that is another big difference between Hugh and Augustine. Hugh is more into the idea of following the Hieronymian or the Jerome idea of Hebrew truth. That is, try our best to recover the ancient languages and start with those texts insofar as they're available as the text from which we create all vulgar translations. So the scholars will do their work in the original languages. The junior varsity people or the lay people who are not able to read will get translations, but those translations, insofar as possible, should be derived from, or at least corrected by, the original text. That is the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. Okay, so that's an idea you begin to see anticipated in Hugh of St. Victor. Again, which was fairly unusual for his time, Hugh does seem to have known Hebrew and have taken the time to learn Hebrew. Thirdly, the important aspect about Hugh is his love of history and the importance of history in biblical interpretation. That is to say, what is the history that's reflected in the text? What was going on at the time this text was written? How can that shed light in the text's literal meaning? Also implied in this also is the history that's of the text. That is to say, the various changes and the problems that you get from the process of copying the text down from age to age. The difficulties in the loss of, in some cases, the meanings of original words, the loss of the knowledge of the languages, which has to be recovered by effort. All of these things are significant too in interpreting the Bible as well. Yeah. Finally, the problem of simply the textual problems that creep in to the Bible when you copy it down repeatedly, hundreds and hundreds of times through the centuries. How the Bible changes in text, and how can we recover the original text? These are problems that were very much implicit in much of Hugh's work. And so in that way, Hugh is in many ways the kind of leading figure of the Renaissance, even though he took place before centuries before the Renaissance really got going. And so I think it's a worth time to spend a little bit of time on him. This week, we're going to look more and more about the Renaissance itself and its great love of history and the great love of original texts and the learning of ancient languages. There's one thing that really characterizes the Renaissance. It's a rebirth, but it's a rebirth that comes about as a result of a sort of rebirth of learning the ancient. So it's in effect a Back to the Future model. We learn new things by relearning the old things that over time we've forgotten. And we're going to see that process is very good and very wholesome, because it enriches our knowledge of the Bible significantly, because if we're only studying the Bible in translation, we have to realize that a translation is itself an interpretation. All translations are interpretations in some degree. All translations both add and subtract to meaning that's given in the original. And so we have to kind of correct ourselves periodically by going back to the original to really check to see, is this interpretive tradition that's really sprung from this translated text, is it really a good reflection of what the original text really said? That's important. Okay. And so you're going to see, though, that process is a little bit potentially destabilizing, because sometimes in the course of doing that, you're going to end up concluding that some of the interpretive tradition is, if not wrong, definitely in need of significant refinement. And a famous discussion is the one that centers around the meaning of Isaiah 7:14, which for centuries had been taken to be a literal prophecy of the virgin birth of Christ. But with a careful analysis, especially of the Hebrew original, you begin to see more and more that, this text actually probably, in fact, almost certain is, that I want to start out by discussing. So how do we actually embrace the literal sense of Isaiah 7:14? Let's start maybe a discussion on that. How do we embrace this issue of Matthew using this as a prophecy of the birth of Jesus, when in reality in Isaiah 7:14 the text seems to be pointing to something else? Is there a way that we can actually solve that little interpretive conundrum, which for us is a conundrum, but in the ancient time was actually very, very controversial? It was very controversial really until the 17th century or 18th century or so, for a Catholic scholar to admit that the text in Isaiah 7:14 originally referred to something other than the birth of Jesus. So this is something I think that's worth spending a little bit of time on for us. So the question is, how do we deal with that? Do we have to correct the interpretation of Isaiah 7:14? Are we permitted to sort of wrench it out of context because Matthew seems to have done that? Or did Matthew maybe not wrench it out of context, but maybe have a different idea of prophetic fulfillment that's maybe a little bit more nuanced, and one that we should have to understand better ourselves before we say that we have to, in effect, force an interpretation on Isaiah 7:14 that maybe doesn't seem to be in the original text. And then, of course, we're going to see this problem happening again and again as time goes on, that interpretive tradition, small t tradition, needs to be refined and in some ways corrected. And so the question is how we do this and remain faithful to what our own theological pedigree is in terms of what we've inherited from the New Testament. So these are all very interesting things I want to talk about this week. Remember as well that this is also the beginning of the Renaissance period. There's another kind of unspoken reality about all of this in terms of what's going on in terms of the late Middle Ages, when we're looking at the Oxford School headed by Robert Grosseteste, as well as the great Franciscan exegete Nicholas of Lyra, that all of these interpreters, not only did they take for granted that it was essential to read the Old Testament first and foremost in Hebrew, but the implication of learning Hebrew was that you have to learn from people who know Hebrew. And who's that going to be? Well, it's going to be Jews who happen to be living in and around places that these Christian scholars in the late Middle Ages had access to. And so there's really the recognition that it's essential in this sort of historical, literary, late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, we could say, model of biblical interpretation that we have to be willing to learn from Jews as well. Now, this is also something rather new. Now, again, not entirely new because, of course, Jerome and his model of Hebrew truth, had apparently learned Hebrew from either a Jew or a Jewish convert to Christianity. We're not exactly sure. But at any rate, the idea that we could learn from Jews in interpreting the Old Testament was, needless to say, a little bit controversial, because Jews, if you know, according to this letter and spirit model, read the Old Testament only according to the letter. In effect, they're blinded to the spirit. They're, in effect, spirit blinded. And so why would we be able to learn from them when they're reading the Bible, in effect, not fully cognizant of all the ways in which it points us to Jesus Christ? Well, that's, of course, an idea that's going to come under pressure as the late Middle Ages rolls along, and more people see the importance of understanding the literal meaning of the Old Testament and the Hebrew language as well. Now, this is not entirely limited to people who are sort of in this kind of Renaissance, proto-Renaissance biblical interpretive model. St. Thomas Aquinas, who is usually not thought of as a proto-Renaissance figure at all, because of his emphasis on the literal sense of the Bible and the idea that the literal sense is fundamental to all interpretive spiritual senses afterwards, St. Thomas Aquinas was not above, citing Rabbi Moses Maimonides and Rabbi Rashi, two great medieval figures of biblical interpretation who would help shed light at least on the literal sense of the Old Testament, where in the Christian spiritual sense model, or the allegories of which Christian interpretation of the Old Testament was well known for, could find their basis, could be based on. Okay, so but the idea of learning more and more from Jews is another kind of side consequence of this greater emphasis on Hebrew truth, and it is a departure in some ways from the model of the Church Fathers, okay, in which the Jewish interpretive tradition is simply wrong, because it can't see the Old Testament as being a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, and therefore what will we have to learn from Jews? Well, we still need them for the literal sense of the Old Testament. We still need them for Hebrew. We still need them for all of the things that could shed light on the Bible, the Old Testament, that is, that we've inherited from them. And so this is, of course, a very important development, which we'll see prefigured this week. Okay, I'm interested in meeting this week. If you all want to, maybe Thursday night again, let me know if you're available for that. I wasn't able to last week, but I think I will have time this week. So I will circulate this out there, and you can tell me if you'd like to come, and I will set it up on Zoom. So, okay, well, thanks a lot, and I will look forward to hearing from you in the discussion this week.